Hello everyone, welcome to another video edition of Filmsplaining. I'm your host, Martyn Strange. It's Black History Month, and I wanted to use that as an opportunity to dive into a filmmaker whose work I've always wanted to examine and fully immerse myself in, and just never have for some reason. Arguably the most celebrated and important Black filmmaker of the last 50, 60 years, Spike Lee. I've been aware of Spike Lee's work for several years, but when I started thinking about it, I realized I'd only seen a few of his movies, and I wanted to take this time to actually catch up on a lot of the very important seismic cultural works that he has contributed to the art of cinema. Spike Lee is known for his razor-sharp social commentary and all of these incredible stylistic and aesthetic flourishes in his movies that are derived from his vast knowledge of film history. He has all of these really fun aesthetic choices, like using archival footage and using quotes from famous Black Americans in the beginnings and endings of his films, utilizing certain camera moves, dolly movements, staging things very theatrically, almost like they are a play. And he uses all of these things to mash up multiple genres into one film, very often culminating in a style that seems to contain a lot of film history, but also kind of defy categorization. Lee loves to work with a lot of the same cast and crew over and over again. He has people who he returns to time and time again to help him realize his vision. People like his father, Bill Lee, who is a composer, Ernest Dickerson, the cinematographer for many of his early works, I think lends an extraordinary amount of craft to his movies. He's had the same editor for many of his films. He utilizes actors that he loves working with, like Denzel Washington and Delroy Lindo and Angela Bassett. So this video is to celebrate Spike Lee and to really kind of try and boil down to, I think, what are his most essential movies and ones that anyone who's interested in his work or in especially Black filmmaking history simply has to watch. The first one, which is the first movie that I ever saw of his, is She's Gotta Have It, his first movie from 1986. This film stars Tracy Camilla Johns, John Terrell, Spike Lee, and his sister Joy Lee. This movie is a kind of raunchy sex comedy in the vein of classic kind of screwball comedies, very reminiscent of like a Billy Wilder movie. It's shot in black and white. It looks gorgeous. Some just really beautiful, immaculate shots in this movie. There's one color sequence that kind of explodes onto the frame in the middle of nowhere, and you're not expecting it. And it's a really, really sharp and interestingly realized scene in the film. This film follows a character, Nola Darling, and her experiences with these three wildly different men who are all her lovers. It's tackling gender politics of the time. This movie also mixes up just all of these genres to form something completely fresh and new. There are elements of like Cassavetes, there are elements of noir. He's using jazz and hip hop to score and soundtrack this film. It's just becomes this kind of explosion of new, fresh invention. A lot of these things that Spike's doing in this first movie seem to anticipate the whole kind of 90s indie cinema boom that characterizes the Sundance Film Festival and many other things. I mean, without this movie, you don't really get stuff like Clerks and a lot of like Tarantino's early work and a lot of Steven Soderbergh's early work. It's just really fun, really entertaining, gorgeously shot love scenes. The interplay between the characters is just really exciting, and it feels new even to this day. Next is Do the Right Thing from 1989. This film really launched Spike Lee into the stratosphere. It is his calling card. He became extraordinarily well known after this film. Stars Danny Aiello, Spike Lee himself. He loves to cast himself in his early movies. John Turturro, Bill Nunn, Giancarlo Esposito, Rosie Perez, and again, Joy Lee, his sister. This is the very first movie that I added to my Letterboxd watch list some years ago, probably something like 5 years ago now. That's how long I've been ruminating on this film, and it took me this long to finally watch it. It's about the hottest day of summer in Brooklyn, which turns into this examination of racial hatred and divide, and ultimately proves how we must come together to overcome these kinds of things. It's so sharply stylized and multi-layered. There are some amazing performances in this movie, amazing music. This is really, I think, where Spike's appreciation for music comes into play, and then goes on to kind of characterize every other movie that he makes after this. It often plays like theater. There are these scenes where characters are speaking directly to camera. Lots of breaking the fourth wall in Spike Lee movies. He loves to do this time and time again. But it's all contained in this one little section of the neighborhood, and you get to know so much about these people and who they are through their interactions and through the way this situation just escalates and escalates and escalates up into the point of a shocking amount of violence, police brutality, and a fire that destroys this business. It feels more poignant now than ever. Sadly, it's more relevant today than it ever has been. Just so powerful. A really jaw-dropping movie, and by far his best one. Next is Malcolm X from 1992. If Do the Right Thing is kind of Spike's most well-known and his calling card movie, Malcolm X is his magnum opus. This is just a huge step up in every possible level of filmmaking from the previous film. Stars Denzel Washington as Malcolm X, and Angela Bassett, and Delroy Lindo. This is a massive biopic on the very controversial and legendary Muslim leader of Black liberation in America. It is literally a cradle-to-grave story. You follow his rise as a kind of con man, a local crook in Boston. He gets imprisoned. We follow his entire imprisonment and how he discovers the religion of Islam via another inmate there. And then we see him completely turn his life around and change everything about who he is. We see him become a scholar, and he is rising now again in the ranks of Islam, becomes one of the greatest, most important Black leaders of activism in the country and in history. This is a phenomenal performance from Denzel, who unbelievably lost the Oscar this year to Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman, of all things. Angela Bassett was not even nominated for her work, and she's extraordinary here. This is a true American fable. It depicts the hardships and the struggles that Black Americans have faced time and time again just to gain equality. There's much more nuance and many more layers to who Malcolm X was as a man, as a person, than previously we were led to believe. I mean, when I was taught about him in school, it was simply that he was the sort of violent equivalent of Martin Luther King. Yes, he did advocate for violence against people early in his sort of ascendancy, but then he kind of changed his mind on a lot of that. He turned around on a lot of the more transgressive ideas that he was preaching. He was very initially against integration of the races. He believed in full segregation. He changed his mind on that and came around on that issue to become this person who ultimately decided that the things that he had previously believed were not actually the best way to achieve the goal that he and his people were aiming for. And those kinds of stories do not get told often enough, especially in American cinema. This, like I said, is a magnum opus. It's massive, it's long, and it feels like a true, just classic American story in cinema. I was blown away by it. Next is Crooklyn from 1994. This is a much more personal movie. It's going back to examining Spike Lee's own kind of childhood. It's a semi-autobiographical tale of this dysfunctional Brooklyn family in the 70s. They are struggling to make ends meet, and they're struggling to get along and understand each other. It's a lot lighter in tone especially the first half of it, to much of his earlier work. You're really kind of with the children's POV for the majority of this movie. There are times where you go back to the parents' POV. The parents are played, I should say, by Delroy Lindo and Alfred Woodard, who are both just staggeringly good in this movie once again. But you're with the children most of the time, and all of these characters are just so lovingly drawn, and their interactions are so real and authentic. It's chaotic, it's hectic, it's hard to watch at times because these kids are just screaming at each other for many sequences. Amazing needle drops, once again, as always in this movie. Still very affecting, emotional film that I was really surprised by how much I liked it. Next is Inside Man from 2006. This is Spike Lee's heist movie. A little bit of a genre mix-up here. It's a kind of post 9/11 commentary on greed and a sort of legacy of racial hatred and racial divide stemming back, way back to World War II. It stars Denzel Washington, Clive Owen, and Jodie Foster. It's about a bank robber who's trying to get away with this heist, but really, as we come to realize, along with Denzel Washington's central detective character, it's actually about much more than that. It's ultimately not really about the heist, more than what it symbolizes and what it represents. It's a very smart, escalating movie that keeps you on the edge and keeps building towards the end. There's some kind of weird and wild zags that it takes, especially in the third act. But again, this contains many of Spike's trademark camera moves. I watched these out of order, so I think this was the first time that I saw the shot where a character is in very close-up POV and kind of gliding, moving along on what seems to be some kind of motorized thing. I'm not sure how he does this move. He does it in almost all of his movies, but they're not walking. They seem to be just kind of floating towards wherever they're trying to get to, and it's very effective. It's a very powerful camera trick that he loves to pull in different situations. Sometimes this movie kind of feels like maybe it was a for-hire job, like it's not quite as personal and it doesn't contain as much of his, I think, authorial voice as a filmmaker, but he's also definitely examining things that he's really interested in. This is really interesting because I've never really understood the appeal of Clive Owen as an actor, but this is like a huge year for him. He does this and Children of Men both in 2006, and I'm just like, I can't really figure out what the appeal of Clive Owen was at this time, why he was like the guy that people were going to for their leads, but that's a me problem nonetheless. Definitely watch Inside Man. It's pulse-pounding, really electrifying, fun entertainment. Next is Black Klansman from 2018. Stars John David Washington, Adam Driver, Topher Grace, and Laura Harrier. This is a movie based on a true story about this time in the late 70s. A black officer and his Jewish colleague, they are going undercover in an attempt to infiltrate the KKK. It's a baffling, wild story that you really cannot believe it's true. Ron Stallworth, the real-life officer who did this, wrote a book about it that the film is based on. This is the only one I didn't get to rewatch for this video, so it's been quite a while since I've seen it. I do remember it being one of Spike's more kind of pointed social satires. You know, there's a lot of like really difficult, nasty stuff in this movie. You know, he's tackling obviously one of the nastiest subjects, especially in the form of David Duke, who's played by Topher Grace here. This movie, bafflingly to me, is not streaming anywhere right now that I could find, but please seek it out if you can find it, if you've not already seen this movie. It's a really strong entry, especially in his kind of later career, that reflects so much of what he's done before and also still feeling new and very fresh. Last is The Five Bloods from 2020. This was a straight-to-Netflix movie that I did not watch in 2020, although I'm sure that I meant to, and I'm sure that I had it on my list. I just never got around to it. This stars the late Chadwick Boseman, Delroy Lindo, Isaiah Whitlock, Clark Peters, and Norm Lewis as The Five Bloods. It's the story of 4 black Vietnam vets who are going back to Vietnam to hopefully find the remains of their lost fellow soldier, played by Chadwick Boseman, as well as a fortune of gold that they have buried. What they've discovered is that landslides here have loosed a lot of the earth, and they think that they can sort of track down the area in the jungle where they were to try and find this treasure. It's often this kind of classic swashbuckling style adventure movie in the vein of Treasure of the Sierra Madre, but it's also a very personal, very dark, and often violent movie. It's a very powerful movie, but also it feels extremely dated, even given that it's just 5 years old. There are a lot of things in this movie that just have not aged well, especially the Trump references. I know that Spike was trying to tackle this kind of right in the moment, but it just feels really sour, especially considering that he's now back in the White House. Obviously, Chadwick Boseman's passing is a lot to take in here when you're watching him. I believe this was his last completed role. And then there's the Jonathan Majors of it all, obviously pre-scandal, but it's hard to watch him in a performance now given what we have uncovered about him as a person. A lot of things that keep this from being, for me, the kind of upper echelon of Spike movie. It's also quite long, but it's also one of those movies that you don't really know what they would cut out of it to make it shorter and make it run a little more smoothly. It has this slick kind of trademark Netflix polish that all of their movies look like. There isn't quite the Spike trademark visuals on a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of great needle drops in this movie, especially all of the Marvin Gaye stuff. He's all over the soundtrack. Remarkable, gutting performance from Delroy Lindo, especially in the last act. There is a segment where he is speaking directly to camera, doing this almost Shakespearean type monologue that's very powerful and affecting. Okay, so those are the essential Spike Lee joints. There is a lot that I didn't get to and haven't gotten to see yet. Stuff like Bamboozled, Girl 6, Chirac, He Got Game. There are so many other movies that he's made, and he's also made a lot of different kinds of movies while still retaining his voice. If you're interested in black cinema and the history of what Spike Lee has done for the form, please seek out all of these movies and the rest of his filmography. He's become one of my favorite filmmakers recently, and I was really excited to do this little fun project. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, and happy viewing.